I threatened to kill Jeremy if he didn't let me teach tonight. So he's suffering from some pretty bad allergies. They were kind enough to pet sit, and didn't realize the pets brought some pretty nasty dander with them. So he asked if I'd fill in for him tonight, so his voice doesn't completely run away on him. Okay, we are in Matthew chapter 22. Matthew chapter 22. Some really loaded and rich passages in here. We're never going to be able to do justice to them in a one setting kind of thing, but hopefully we can touch on some stuff as we run through the last part of this chapter and get into chapter 23. And our questions will be starting verses 34 to 40, that little section right there. Before we get started, let's have a word of prayer. Our holy and righteous Father, we're so thankful to you for the day you've given us. We're thankful for warmer temperatures and helping to melt some of the snow and feel a little less of the burden of the depths of winter. We thank you for that. And we thank you for this comfortable place that we can come together and meet. We thank you for this family that meets here from time to time. And we ask that you will bless us, that you will help us to grow, help us to be loving and forgiving of others and of each other, and to work together to be the family of Christ in this city, in this location. Bless our studies, that it will all grow as disciples, knowing that we are all both learners and teachers, expanding our understanding of your word and of your heart and your mind, the things that you have preserved for us so that we can be more like you. Please help us to understand these things and to treasure these things always. Be with our sick, our shut-in, those who've lost loved ones recently. Help those who are in the midst of various crises that are oftentimes unseen by the naked eye, but that you know and that you know intimately, Lord. Please give mercy and strength to all who call upon you for it. Thank you most of all for our Savior, and it's through his name that we pray. Amen. Okay, as we're coming toward the end of chapter 22, we get into a couple of pieces of dialogue that Jesus has that are, I think, very well known and are very powerful, quite frankly. But as this part begins here in verse 34, people have been coming to Jesus on and off throughout his ministry. But as we know, as he comes to his last week, the things intensify. And Jesus he very much allows for that to happen, right? I mean, he sets himself up to be here. There were certain conflicts that he would avoid when there were things that, he would go a certain place, go around a certain place. There were times where the confrontation, it wasn't time to let that play out fully because he knew it would lead to him being crucified, him being killed at some point in time, and it wasn't time yet. It's time now. And so the proverbial gloves are coming off, as he is getting to a very blunt point in his ministry. And the dialogue that he has in this particular point, or this particular chapter, I think is quite telling. First, kind of on an individual level, after he has hushed the Sadducees, but then, of course, even more so as it grows to the Pharisees in general with the question he's going to have for them. And it's always interesting when Jesus has a question for somebody. People have lots of questions for him, and rightly so. But when he turns around and asks a question, then it's okay, because Jesus is always asking questions, and that question always says more than any answer that I can ever give, right? I have found in teaching with certain denominations that there are some groups that come into your home and they basically, we're here to learn you some stuff, not the other way around. We're here to teach you something, but you better not teach them. And so the best way to try to make points is to ask questions. And of course, Jesus is the master of that. He's the master of teaching by asking questions, and that certainly is one way. He didn't do it. Maybe he did it more than I'm thinking off the top of my head, but it seems like he didn't do it as much as people approached him with questions. But nevertheless, we get into chapter 22. I'm not sure where part is coming from in Rick's brain. But verse 34 starting, when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him and saying, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." So the question that the Pharisee has for Jesus is what? What is he asking him? Okay, what's the greatest? Yeah, what's the greatest command? Now, is that something that is that an unfair question? Is that an illogical question? Well, what do you think about that? Is that something that strikes you as being a nefarious question? I don't. I think that's something that would certainly be interesting to note and to consider. And even though the text talks about him coming and questioning him or testing him, when we go over to Mark chapter 12, and I highly recommend that you look at that parallel passage, Mark gives a lot more detail about what's happening. And we find out that his motives are much more pure than what Matthew seems to kind of hint at. And it's been suggested that this idea of testing him is not so much a testing of Jesus as it is kind of this guy wanting to show that he and Jesus were kind of on the same wavelength almost. Like sometimes you ask a question that you know the answer to, and you know that person knows the answer to it, and you kind of want to share in that. Like, hey, I know the answer to this, and I know you do too, so let's talk about that. Yeah, that's fun, and show what we know sort of thing. And so there was probably some ego in it, but Mark makes it clear that there was genuineness to it, because Jesus even tells him, you're not far from the kingdom. And so he's different than what the guys that had been previously, because you notice in verse 34 it says, when the Pharisees had heard that he silenced the Sadducees. That word silenced apparently is a very strong word for basically shut them up. It's not just that he quieted them, but it's very much the idea of just slam the door on their idea. It's a very strong word from what the commentator I was reading was saying in the Greek. It's very much not just they decided they better not say anything. They got the door slammed on them in mid-stupidity, right? And so Jesus slammed the door on them. And so it empowered or emboldened a little bit this particular guy to come and ask this question. And so it's, well, what is the greatest commandment? And so what then, question 2, what is Jesus, what kind of answer does he give? What does he say? Okay. Right. And Jesus doesn't allow this question to simply silence with one, does he? He takes and offers a second answer, and that second answer is, okay, love your God with everything you got and love your man as yourself. So basically, love God, love man. And so the one question, really, Jesus is letting him know that I don't want you to walk away from this conversation thinking that loving God is only about loving God, because connected to it, inseparable from it, is the idea of loving your neighbor as yourself. And I think that's very important, because as we understand more and more about the development of the church in the first century and what the book of Acts provides for us and the different letters that Paul and Peter and others have written, we understand that loving our brothers, especially John's various letters, is essential. If you hate your brother, you are a murderer, he says. And it's something that is hard for some people. The idea of loving God, yeah, you're right. But then loving your fellow man, loving your neighbor as yourself, I mean, we can play games with that sometimes, can't we? Well, who's my neighbor? Right? And those kind of things come up because people, I think, are oftentimes more accepting of the idea that, well, I better pay some sort of homage and love and respect to the divine, to divinity. But my fellow man's an idiot. The people around me are, just look at the world around us. We are filled and bombarded with selfishness and foolishness and stupidity and evil everywhere. My wife was just telling me about one of the students that rides on one of the buses that not her bus, but somebody else's, that her daughter came home, or the daughter came home and found mother and father yesterday had been killed. Father killed the mother. It was a murder-suicide, and the daughter came home and had to find their bodies like that. And all I could think about today, and was kind of emphasizing to Abby, is this world is broken and it's evil. Don't ever be fooled into thinking otherwise, because man's inhumanity to man is one of the things that infuriates God the most. One of the top ways we show our love to God is by showing our love to each other, to our family. I mean, the human race is one family, despite all the divisions that are emphasized in our culture today. But Jesus is saying, love God and love man. These are the things that matter the most. And he wanted them to be connected. And so, we want to make sure that they're connected as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. And one of the things that ancient Israel struggled with the most was they wavered in their love for Yahweh, but one of the things that was abundantly clear was the cruelty they would show to the fatherless, the orphan, the widow. They would oppress people, and especially the northern kingdom, when they were judged, one of the big things that God hammered was you took advantage and stepped all over the little people, and now I'm going to smash you for it. Because I defend the fatherless and the widow and the poor and things like that, which, as a side note, is a very important warning to a nation that slaughters 1 million babies a year. That there is a voice that will cry out for them, even though theirs have been silenced. The innocent blood shouts out from the ground, to kind of use the imagery from God speaking of Abel. That man can't just treat his fellow man however he wants. That there will be an accounting. And hopefully as God's children we understand that. But, sometimes we get selfish, and sometimes I know, but if I show enough, piety to God, and I pray enough, and I come to church enough, and I, don't do evil things over here, then how I treat my fellow man, even just indifferently, is going to be okay. And of course, sheep and the goats, when Jesus talks about, it's the stuff you didn't do to me, he says, that is going to be the reason why the goats are separated and tossed aside. Always a powerful reminder. Any other thoughts before we kind of move on to the next section? Robin? Yeah, it's there are many stories that I have of brethren who have a hard time loving each other, forgiving each other, and I've even had to warn a couple of times where, listen, that attitude is not pleasing to God. Do you understand that? What you're saying now, if you're just venting, then I'd say, pull up your britches and get a handle on things. I understand the difference between venting and having a way of life, a method of operations. Unfortunately, the people that I've had to rebuke very much made it clear that this is how I feel, and God's just going to have to deal with that, basically, is kind of the attitude that they have. And it's this whole love thing, it takes work, doesn't it? I mean, if you've ever had to love people who are annoying or needy or even hurtful to you, who can wear you down, it's not easy. But it's part of what we signed up for. Jesus never said it was going to be easy. He said it's going to take a lot of work. Do you imagine it was easy for him to deal with all the shenanigans of even his own disciples? As men, we were kind of talking about that last night, to have been a fly on the wall and to have been able to see some of Jesus' facial reactions with some of the stupid things the disciples did and said, and just the kind of hand up to the forehead type moments. Jesus had them because people do dumb things. And I'm people. I'm a person. I do dumb things too, and so do you. And so we vex God, we grieve him, we frustrate him, and we vex and grieve and frustrate each other. But it's not that those who do not vex and frustrate you are those that you love. It's you love everyone. And It's too easy to kind of gloss over passages like this and like, yeah. We know we're supposed to do that, but let's just kind of tuck that in the corner, right? No, this is our salvation depends on this, because as Robin was saying, if we can't love somebody that we can see, how can we pretend to think that we can love someone or someone that we can't see? How can we pretend to love someone that we actually haven't seen? That it takes more faith and more commitment and trust. The point is, you don't. If you don't love your fellow man, you don't love God, no matter how much you tell yourself that. Because someone who loves God understands that every single human being is his baby, his little boy, his little girl. That's what we are. And I say it that way for a reason, because it helps me to think of, no matter how old and wise and stubborn someone may be in my eyes, they are that little tiny child that comes into the world. We all are that. And that we never cease to be that precious to him. We can see an innocent child and love and be tolerant and patient with them, at least for a little while, because they're cute. But it's when we get older and we start talking and we don't stop talking, that those kind of things make it more frustrating and more difficult. And so we got to find ways to make ourselves see each other the way he does. And that's not an easy task, but it is one that is essential to our growth. Okay, anything else? Harvey? Yeah, because in the next chapter, he's going to lay on the Pharisees and the guys who are supposed to be the spiritual leaders. He's going to let them know, these guys, they're hypocrites. They're fakes. And they claim to be pious, but they don't love their fellow man. And certainly that is something that he's going Chapter 23 is a doozy, I tell you. It's even just rereading some of this tonight and thinking about it, just sometimes I shake my head thinking, wow, what that must have been like for anybody who had been with him, like his disciples, to hear him go at him like this. I bet they were cringing, thinking, what are you doing? Wait a minute, you're fixing to get yourself in real trouble here. Even though he told them that's what was going to happen, I can imagine them just saying, well, wait a minute, not this kind of trouble. What are you doing? And there were probably some people on the sideline going, yes, you lay it on them, because they knew the hypocrites that they were. But nevertheless, it's not easy for people to love each other because of the selfishness and the ego and the things that Satan uses so well to make us feel somehow better, superior, more worthy, all those things that I know I struggle with. Looking down my nose at somebody who, they've done something really bad or really stupid, and feeling superior to them, and that's never going to be the case. I'm not better than Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin. I'm not. I'm not more worthy. I received God's grace because I sought it, and I'm trying to be a better person in my walk, but I'm not more worthy than anyone who has ever lived. Difference is in the relationship that I have chosen to pursue, that they have not. And so that's what we have to keep those things in mind. Okay, let's look at the next section, verse 41 starting. While the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, saying, what do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? And they said to him, well, the son of David. And he said to them, well, how then does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son? No one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day on did anyone dare question him anymore. So, what is the basic question first that Jesus is asking here? What's he getting at in the question itself? Okay, so we're just looking at the quote. Yahweh said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Now, they understood that the person that is writing this is whom? Jesus tells us who's writing it. The Spirit is saying it through whom? Through David. So David is saying, Yahweh said to my Lord, who they all understood in this context to be messianic. Like there's no questions about that, okay? This is messianic. They understood it that way. So Yahweh says to the Messiah, sit at my right hand until I make your enemy your footstool. But David calls the Messiah what? Lord. Now, so at this point in time, they are the better part of 1,000 years removed from the days of David, which would mean that if the Messiah is the son of David, then he is an ancestor of David, he is a, what's the word here? Descendant, thank you. I was about to really confuse you there if you know what I was trying to get at. He's a descendant of David by 1,000 years. Lots and lots of generations. Many of you knew my grandfather. He did not call me Lord, okay? He is my grandpa. And in fact, one time when I was little, he chided me for calling my dad old man. My dad used to call himself my old man all the time. And of course, I was a kid. I didn't know what that meant. So one time when I was like 8 or 9, I was like, yeah, my old man did this. And Grandpa, what? That's the only time Bill Boz will ever even remotely raise his voice at me. And of course, I'm lucky my britches were still clean at that point. But, he was very much, hey, that's a respect thing. That's not how things, I didn't know the difference. But certainly, you don't look at your successors and call them Lord. But that's what David did. So why is David calling the Messiah his 1,000 years at least in the future? They know because they're at that point. Why is he calling him Lord when he is his great-grandson? Why is that? And so that's the question, first of all, that he is framing for them. He's challenging them to stop and think about something that they all knew and read repeatedly and were comfortable with, and yet they hadn't thought about this. Yeah, go ahead, Dave. What were you going to say? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what question 2 is. What point is Jesus now establishing about the Christ by quoting David? So Dave is saying that Christ is superior to David. But how does that work? Robert? Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, his perspective, the Christ's perspective, is one that they have accepted for generations, for 1,000 years, that is superior to David. They've accepted that, but did they realize that? It's kind of like when we talk about the resurrection. Do we realize what we're talking about? That we're talking about a body, and what is a resurrection? It is a dead person coming back to life. Not a ghost floating somewhere, but a dead person coming back to life. A person's body whose spirit was separated from him, a la James. Body without the spirit is dead. Well, the spirit comes back to the body, body's reanimated. But of course, we're told even more that it's changed. But sometimes it's, you read that, you see that, but do you stop and think about some of the logistics of it? And so Jesus is challenging them here with this. But the question then is, why? Why is Jesus challenging them? What point is he trying to drive home to them about what they believed but didn't understand? What did they believe but not understand about the Christ? They believed what about the Christ's identity, let's say? He's king. How about from, as Robin was saying, he's from eternity. That he is before and he is superior to, so his identity is far and above that of David's. That there's an eternal perspective to this. So they believed that because they accepted Yahweh says to David's Lord, who's going to be David's descendant. Well, I don't know why I'm having so much trouble with that word. If I stare blank for 2 seconds, just say that word. That's probably what I'm trying to come up with. That David's descendant is David's Lord. And so with that, that's what they believe, but what don't they understand about that then? If the Christ is before, in terms of primacy, superiority, is before David and all of those things, the Christ is going to appear someday on earth, right? That's what they believe. That's what they've been told. So what is it that they believe about him but don't understand about the Christ? If he is going to be incarnate one day, what is that going to mean about his identity? Okay, that's very much what we're going along with. Did you have your hand up, Jeremy? Your name's not Jeremy. Go ahead. No, I don't know if he had his hand up or not. He may have been scratching his beard. So go ahead, Dave. He's shaking his head no. Okay, go ahead. Okay. Okay. Any, Lori? Exactly. They're not, and that's really what I was trying to get at. I didn't mean to ask the question cryptically, but I think it's important to realize this. They believed in general of the supremacy and quasi-deity. I don't know what you'd say of Jesus, or excuse me, of the Christ. But follow that through to its logical conclusion, they did not. In order for someone who is a descendant, see, I got it this time, at least 1,000 years, if not more, to be someone's Lord, the way that human ancestry works, there has to be something that about him that predates David. Something about his power, his authority, and even his existence. I want to suggest that it's the authority aspect that Jesus is getting at here, because I think that it's why chapter 23 is what's going to happen. Jeremy's done a great job of illustrating God doesn't put stuff, and Jesus doesn't put stuff where it is just randomly. He's setting the table for what's about to happen in chapter 23, where authority is going to lay the smackdown on all these guys. The Christ is Lord over even David. He possesses an authority and even, yes, a pre-existence as we've come to describe it. But they hadn't thought that through. And you can't completely fault them, because obviously God's plan was hidden for a reason in many ways. But there were things that they were rejecting. They were fighting against it. And when it came to Jesus' identity and what other people were saying, they knew people were saying he was the Son of God. And he's calling on them to stop and think about, well, the Son of God would be a perfect explanation for why David called the Messiah Lord. Because who else would be greater than David but Yahweh? Jeremy?
They wanted a king. They were looking for a king. But they weren't looking for the king at the time. They were looking for a king more than their own image. Look at it. So he's really correcting that notion that no, he's not just a king. He's the Lord himself.
Yeah.
And there's a rapid race around it.
Yeah. It's something that they were struggling to fit into. That what Jesus was, it wasn't even what Jesus was saying. It's what other people were saying. It's what his deeds and the Spirit himself was testifying to who he was. I mean, it's right there. And there's a reason they're fighting against it. And part of it is they didn't connect the dots and or they connected them and they only went so far. And so it's not that the Jews were idiots of their law. They knew their law in a lot of ways, but there's a difference between knowing something academically and then seeing the practical aspects of how it applies to everything that's going on. Harvey? Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. I mean, Jesus is, in so many ways, he's the fulfillment of the law, of the promise, of all these different things. He brings that all to its fullness and then eclipses it, as Dave was saying earlier, by the fact that he ever lives. He has the power of an endless life, all the things that physical priests don't possess. And so he comes together and culminates in all those different things and is the exclamation point of all these different promises, of all these different laws, all these different concepts. And so Jesus is raising the bar again, trying to help them to understand what is ultimately going on here and why, at least I think in particular, why the things he's going to be saying soon are going to hit hard. I mean, Jesus is clearly gearing up for a huge confrontation with those who eventually will be allowed to kill him. And he's got some things that he wants to nail them between the eyes with before they do that, because they just don't see their hypocrisy. And you know they've asked before, right? By whose authority do you do these things? And Jesus has used questions before to try to answer, like John the Baptist and stuff like that. But what if they had actually given an honest answer and said, well, it's from heaven? Well, Jesus would have answered them, and he would have told them where this authority comes from. But he is doing that same thing here by asking this question. So follow the question and take it all the way back to, wait a minute. This equates to something grander than what we have ever allowed ourselves to really contemplate. That the Messiah has an authority that even David did not possess. An authority to tell people how his kingdom will be, to allow entrance to, which is going to be one of the woes, right? Entrance isn't controlled by men, it's controlled by the king. And only the king. But again, I think he's setting the table here for what is going to happen here. So then the result of this, the barrage of questions that Jesus had received, as they continue to come after him and ask him questions, now as we are entering this final week of his life, what have people realized about trying to stump Jesus? Yeah, they can't follow him up. And I think it was in Mark 12 where Mark adds the comment that the people were excited about it, that they were cheering him on, that Jesus was explaining things in a way that actually made sense. He wasn't explaining them to fit some pathetic desire to keep his little pocket of authority over people like the Pharisees did. But rather he was explaining things in a way that made sense, that fit and that challenged it. And that's one of the wonderful things about when people are just simply being honest with the Scriptures. The Scriptures explode with clarity when we approach them with honest hearts. Now, there can be more difficult things. I'm not saying you have to understand everything the second you look at it, but the gist of who God's Messiah is and what he expected, it was as clear as day. And these people were starting to gobble this up and to see that Jesus was silencing these guys. Every question they came at him with, he dealt with it. And doesn't that make you feel inspired? Doesn't it put a smile on your face when you read these passages and you see Jesus silence his critics? And it's not just because of the truth factor, but it's also because we're pulling for him. We're pulling for him because we know who he is, and we know that he is here for us, that he's here for all those who want to love and serve him, and so his success is our success. So you got to realize that some of those people that were watching were feeling that too. And that's neat. It's neat to kind of get wrapped up in that and to see that sort of excitement, even though unfortunately a lot of these people are going to change their tune in a few days. But for this moment, it's one of those Mount Carmel moments, right? Yes! Way to knock them upside the head and then show them who's boss. Of course, that wasn't the point. The point was to teach and instruct, but you can you kind of root a little bit for it too, because he's right. And it's about time people started acknowledging he's right. Isn't that what's great about the final day? When we get to see all of human history bow before him and acknowledge finally who he really is, the thing that we know, that we believe, and that we are mocked and ridiculed and made fun of for, the things that our brethren throughout history have been put to death for, the fact that he is the Lord, that all men will have to acknowledge that, that's going to be an awesome day for me, because I get to see him get what he deserves. And so some of those moments in the scriptures are just, yeah, that's great. Anything else before we move on here? Okay, let's go ahead and get into to chapter 23 then. Oops, turn my page here. First 12 verses. And Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit at Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do, but do not do according to their works, for they say, and they do not do. For they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the best places at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. But you do not be called Rabbi, for one is your teacher, Christ, and you are all brethren. And do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, who is in heaven. And do not be called teacher, for one is your teacher, the Christ. But he who is greatest among you shall be your servant. And whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. So what was the first way that Jesus basically cites the Pharisees in their hypocrisy? It's the first way. He does it in two ways. The first way he says what about them? First of all, they sit in Moses' seat, which means what? Okay, they're teaching you the law. So, what are they to do with the Pharisees as far as they sit in Moses' seat? The people should listen. Okay, but what's that? There you go. First is do what they say, not what they do. Because what they are teaching you is true, but then how they go about executing it or not, don't follow that. Okay? Don't follow through with that. Now, then he cites a second way in which they are being hypocritical. And how is that? How does he describe that? Okay. You guys make huge burdensome responsibilities. You lay work and requirements and things like that on these people, but they will not lift a finger to help out themselves. So they're telling you this is important, you should do it, but then they won't follow through with it themselves. One of the great fears, at least I have, of being a teacher is the fact that I feel like there are so many times in my life where there are things I preach on where I feel like a hypocrite because I know I've got holes in those things. It's one of the things you have to swallow as a preacher, that, you know what, it's my job to preach the Word of God, but I'm still working on the whole application part. And there are times when I feel sheepish even, because I'm thinking of the 6 1/2 dozen other ways that I am not doing this as well as I want to, or I may even feel like just a flat out failure. And that happens a lot more than I care to admit. But Jesus isn't talking about people who are trying. He's talking about people who just, they don't care that what they're saying, they don't feel a burden or responsibility to do that. That they will tell you what you should do, but they have no intention of putting that burden on themselves or bearing it. And again, that's the hypocrisy. And so Jesus is setting even more of this table up for, guys, this is the problem. Yes, they should be teaching you what the law of Moses says. Absolutely. They should be doing it too. And we know in God's law, from the lowest of the low to the high priest himself, was anyone in the kingdom of Israel exempt from the law? Who is exempt from the law? Nobody. Nobody. No Jew was allowed to say, yeah, that doesn't apply to me. From the least to the greatest, from the high priest to the king to everybody all the way down, those responsibilities were given to all. Somehow the Pharisees and others like them reinterpreted that and took that in a direction that they should not have taken it. That was not fair at all. Then question 3, why should men refuse titles? What is Jesus getting at here? Why are titles something that should just be non-existent among God's people? Okay, so learning that true exaltation comes through humbling ourselves. That service to God is something that means it's going to involve abasing ourselves, it's going to involve putting ourselves at the expense of others, to spend and be spent, to use Paul's words, for other people. That which is very hard is what God is going to consider great and what he will in fact exalt in his time. But it's learning to see that while we're here, we're just like our master, that we've got work to do. And so these titles involve glorifying man and exalting man before it's time. I mean, make no mistake, you and I are going to be glorified with Jesus. It's coming, and I can't wait. But now, it's not the time. It's not time yet. We might have moments of exaltation. You know, when someone gets up and says something in the announcements, hey, we appreciate, the women that were doing this and working on this, or the fellow, Maverick was working on the things upstairs, appreciate him doing that. Little moments where our service are called out and glorified, but that's not the glory, right? That's not the ultimate culmination. And so these titles of father and teacher and things like that, they're taking away from the ones who actually deserve that. And it makes you cringe sometimes when you hear some of these titles thrown around. Ooh, that belongs to God. That belongs to Christ. And unfortunately, the more people call one another lofty religious titles, the easier it is to swallow the things they teach, which unfortunately are often erroneous. So when we call people certain titles, it's easier to kind of forget that they're just dudes. They're just people. They don't possess some inherent authority from God any more than you do. It's what this says. And I just think that it's easier for people to swallow certain doctrines because Father so-and-so told me, or Reverend so-and-so told me, as opposed to, the big fat guy of the two guys that work at Portage said this. It's a lot easier to disregard what he said than some kind of religious title. And that's just one of many reasons why it's not good. Most of all because Jesus said, don't do it, which ought to be enough for all of us. Okay, I appreciate your comments, and hopefully Jeremy will be allergy-free by next Wednesday. It's so very clear, it's not, I know. Yeah, I've never talked to somebody who's
Huh? I'm gonna babble. Turn the projector on. Can I do this for you too? Can you turn the projector on? Can I do? Can you not see it? Do you have to pick some up too? Need to help you? I'll grab the book. You got? Short and sweet. Good.
Good evening. I'm going to start off with I Will Sing of the Mercies of the Lord. Gets going here. I will sing of the mercies of the Lord forever. I will sing. I will sing. I will sing of the mercies of the Lord forever. I will sing of the mercies of the Lord. With my mouth will I make known thy faithfulness, thy faithfulness. With my mouth will I make known thy faithfulness to all generations. I will sing of the mercies of the Lord forever. I will sing. I will sing. I will sing of the mercies of the Lord forever. I will sing of the mercies of the Lord. Good
Good evening, everyone. Good to be with you tonight. I've been enjoying our daily Bible reading in Genesis, really reading a lot about Jacob up until the last couple of days. Now we've got into Joseph, but Jacob's been interesting to me, and I've never really thought of Jacob as one of my favorite Bible characters. He's kind of a deceitful guy and scheming, and just had a lot of flaws. I guess maybe I've come to like him because of some of those flaws, the things that he endured. He certainly was rightly named. His name kind of means supplanted. He's always trying to be the king of the hill and conquer. And he had a lot of things that he replicated the same problem that his dad had as far as showing partiality. He did it with his wives, and he did it with his children. You can just see all the baggage that kind of came along with his life. Yet the Bible, God and Moses dedicate more than 10 chapters of the Bible to his life. So there's got to be something that we can learn from him. And I noticed something this time as I was reading through his life that I wanted to share with you. And it just kind of shows the progression of his faith throughout his life. And it's just statements that he makes about God. And we don't know too much about his younger life, but we know that his mom favored him. His dad favored his brother Esau. They came up with this scheme of how he could steal the blessing. And during that process, if you remember the story, he pretends that he's his brother, and his brother was sent out to kill game and bring it back and cook it. And when when Jacob comes into the room, Isaac says, "How could have you done this so fast?" And notice what he says. He says, "Because the Lord your God caused it to happen to me." And I've always thought that's tricky, but notice how he phrases that. He doesn't say the Lord my God. He says the Lord your God. Then notice as he flees, later on he flees from his brother's wrath, and he's going to his uncle's home, and he's in the wilderness, and he has that wonderful dream where it's the stairway to heaven, the ladder, and he wakes up and he's just amazed. How awesome is this place? It is none other than the house of God. But he makes a vow that's interesting. Listen to this. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, "If God will be with me and will keep me on this journey that I take, and will give me food to eat and garments to wear, and I return to my father's house in safety, then the Lord will be my God." And he set up a stone and named it Bethel. So now he's transitioned a little bit. God, you will be my God if you do this. It's kind of you got to fulfill your end of the journey, or the bargain. We know the story. He goes up to Haran, meets Rachel, falls in love with her, winds up marrying her and her sister. He spends 20 years of his life there, and during that time, he inherits the fruits of his deception. Laban is always switching his wages. Thank you, Chuck. You're not the only one having trouble with words tonight, Rick. And at the end, he kind of flees. Laban comes after him, and almost with a threatening force, and accuses him of stealing things. And at the end of that, Jacob gets really riled, and he says the following. Basically, he tells him off. He says, "Hey, if you've changed my wages all these times, you would have sent me away with nothing." But he says this statement: "If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been for me, surely you would have sent me away empty-handed. God has seen my affliction, the toil of my hands, so he rendered judgment last night." So now he kind of is back to where he was at. He acknowledges God, but he says, "It's the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac. It's my dad's God and my grandfather's God. If he hadn't been with me, you'd have sent me away empty-handed." Progress a little bit further down the story. He's working his way back home with his wives and this whole entourage, all the livestock. He's scared to death of Esau's wrath. But Esau welcomes him, falls on his neck, kisses him, welcomes him back. And it says there that after that Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan. And when he came to Padan Aram and camped before the city, And he bought a piece of land where he had pitched the tent from the hand of the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. This is the second piece of land that any of the children of Abraham own. But I shouldn't have read that part. It says this, and then he erected an altar and called it El Elohel Israel. And I never noticed that before, but it means the God of Israel. Just a few verses back, remember the story, that's where Jacob wrestled with an angel. And what did the angel say, change his name to? Israel, right? So now he names this place the God of Israel. In other words, God is my God. And I think that's an interesting progression. It even goes further. In the next chapter, they move back up to Bethel. This is the place where they had been in the wilderness. And Jacob says this to his family. So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, put away the foreign gods which are among you, and purify yourselves, and change your garments. And let us arise and go up to Bethel, and I will make an altar there to God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and has been with me wherever I have gone. So he fulfills his vow to God, makes this testimony to his family. God has fulfilled his part of the bargain. God is my God. And just a couple thoughts about this. I think it's important for us, particularly as men and leaders of families, to make a testimony like that God is my God. I want all of you to know this. Put away your foreign gods, and he is our God alone. I don't know how oftentimes I've made those kind of declarations to my children. They hear me talking up here and saying things, and we study together. But sitting and staring them eye to eye and say, God is my God, and I'm going to serve him all my life, and I expect you to do the same. I think that's an important testimony to make to our families so that they remember that and what we stood for. And that's the same kind of statement is made about Abraham back in his life. That God said Abraham is going to basically force his children to follow me. He's going to set those kind of expectations. I think God appreciates it when we, as leaders in our homes, and mothers can do this too, and you do, I know you do, make those kind of declarations of faith to your children. Then secondly, just acknowledge this progression of faith that we see in Jacob. Because really that's the progression of faith, that transformation that we all go through, I think. We go from God being the God of our mom and dad, or maybe our grandparents, and even, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just the way it is. That's all we know. And even kids, when they get a little bit older, and they're 16, 17, 18, it's still a lot of their parents' faith. Now, not all kids grow up in a church environment like this. I understand that. But they have to go through that process. And it can be sticky. And it can be tricky. And I encourage us as parents, don't be afraid of that. That has to happen. They have to question everything. And hopefully they'll replicate. But some things they may act like they're repudiating it a little bit, but they have to go through that. We all have to take the path that I think Jacob took. Hopefully we don't have to go through all the hardships and make all the mistakes that he made, but that transformation is something we all go through. And I'd like the children to understand that too, the older children especially, that there'll come times where it is the God of my grandparents, it's the God of my parents, it's somebody else's God. But ultimately, we got to get to the point, because I think that's what life is about. It is ultimately making us learn that God is our God. There is none like other than him, and we have to put our faith and trust in him, and ultimately he will deliver. It doesn't mean life is going to be a bed of roses and everything is going to turn out perfect, because it certainly didn't for Jacob. Look at the end of his life. He said, few and miserable have been the years of my life, because he made so many mistakes. But his faith in God was there the whole time, and Jesus said, God said, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob is among the faithful. We'll sit around the table with him someday, even with all his flaws and mistakes and misery. And that may be true for us as well, but staying faithful to the very end. And we'll get to this at the end of Genesis, where basically at the end he pulls his feet in and gives his spirit to God. May that be our story too, that we are faithful to the very end. If we can help anyone start in their faith journey or get back on the right track because you're struggling, and we all do at times, we'd love to help you. We'd love to pray for you. We'd love to baptize someone who's ready to be immersed and have their sins washed away. If we can help in any way, come to the front while we stand and sing.
I know not why God's wondrous grace to